With the newest raid, Crown of Sorrows, being released officially, according to Bungie's API, we now have 10 raid bosses. So what better thing to do than to rank the motherfuckers in order from worst to first? Sort of how the YouTube order sorts out his dildos before fucking himself. Now, before I begin, let's go over some criteria first. Bungie's API gives the official list of what we would consider a raid boss, although I do have to say, I do not fully agree with this list. Encounters like the vault or phase 1 of certain bosses to actually get to the damage phase, they're not actual boss fights. So the opening phase of Gowron's Deception is not a boss for some reason, but the dogs in the Pleasure Gardens are considered a boss fight. I don't like that idea, but nonetheless, Bungie classified it that way, so we're going to roll with that as a boss fight. Next, the criteria that I ranked them on. Obviously, anything subjective like a list is essentially a matter of opinion, and there's no kind of scientific fact in this shit, so I had to offer up my rationale for a ranking system through math, essentially. I came up with 10 categories to rank the raids and how I calculate the total score so that I have a top 10 list that actually has mathematical calculations. Personally, I think the list, for the most part, is going to match where people generally feel a boss falls along the spectrum. There's some natural general consensus as to who people think the best few bosses are, or certainly the worst boss fights, and then obviously there's everything in between. My list, I feel, is pretty close, but obviously people are going to disagree with some of the points that I make during these videos. Final point to note, and I'm going to elaborate this on a future raid corresponding boss video, is the choice of prestige versus non-prestige in the year 1 raids. I'll go into more detail when I get into Calus, Argos, Valkaur, but for the rankings, I will be using Prestige Leviathan, which includes Calus and the dogs, normal Eaters of Worlds, and normal Spires of Stars. In the year 2 raids, they obviously do not have prestige, so that's obviously just one version. But again, I'll get into that more during those videos. The categories that I will be ranking are communication. How much do you need to talk during the fight? Unique elements of the fight. Basically, have we or have we not seen things in the raid before? How difficult was it to unlock the damage phase? The variety of strategies that you can use during the fight. Now think of this like sniper versus shotgun range, whether you use your supers, your weapons, primary ammo versus secondary ammo type of arguments. We'll get into detail a little bit later. Direct threat level of the boss during the fight. Mobility that you need during the encounter. Can a team recover from a mistake? Basically, in other words, will one person's fuck up wipe you, or can you still get through the fight after a fuck up? Number of teammates needed during the mechanics, which I'll have to discuss in a second. Natural difficulty at launch. Not artificial difficulty like making power levels so far to reach for the common players, but the natural difficulty. And finally, are the rewards worth the fight? Is there something you have to get from the boss that is so amazing that you're going to run this raid? Since I have the 10 categories and the 10 bosses, I plan on going into detail into each one of these criteria during the boss discussions. For example, today's boss will get a further explanation on recovering from mistakes and why I consider that to be an important aspect of the raid. Now, each category is going to be rated 0 to 5, although there is an outlier in the teammates for mechanics. So far, almost all these encounters have been completed by the professional couch potatoes with less than a full team. We're talking 2-man, 3-man, solo, for fuck's sake. I don't want that to be considered part of the norm. Yes, it's cool you can 2-man Calus, bro, but the rest of the community uses a full team. So with that in mind, how many people does it take a normal team to unlock the damage phase? What is the bare minimum amount of people who can do everything just to be able to unlock the damage phase? Think of it like this. If you were to carry someone who absolutely sucks at the game, you need them to just chill out and avoid the mechanics. How many others does it take to carry that person through? That's essentially what we're going to talk about when it comes to teammates needed during the rankings. But again, we're going to get into full discussion as to why I thought that was important in a future video. Without further ado, let's kick off the top 10 list, and the very bottom one to rank is dogs in the Pleasure Guard. Now, overall, when you see the ranking of how I put out the points, overall score for dogs is going to be 21. Now, one other final important thing to note, and you guys got to know this, is in the gameplay, I have not had any footage from the dogs. I searched my channel all the way at the beginning, could not find anything decent. I think the only footage that I was able to find was one of the very first encounters of the dog fight. I believe this might have been my second or third raid or attempt. So when you see the strategy, please note we are doing it completely wrong. We did not know how to do the dog encounter. Eventually, obviously, we learned it. But when you look at it in the background, you're going to be like, what the fuck are they doing? we didn't know what to do. We had no clue how we were supposed to do the encounter, so that's why what you're going to see in the background is not that fantastic when it comes to gameplay. And it's going to be looped incessantly because it literally is the only footage that I could find from my own channel. So let's dive into exactly how many points I gave to each one of these categories. Communication. I gave this essentially a 2. During the actual boss fight, there's not really much communication aside from L1 flower, R2 flower, and then it's up to the guys on the floor to really maneuver around the dogs. And although the people on the top can kind of give you a hint of the dog's facing you, the dog turned away, there really isn't that much communication between the team compared to some of the other boss fights that we're going to see a little bit later. Unique elements. I actually gave this a 3. Aside from the Gorgon maze in the Vault of Glass, we really haven't had sort of a stealth section in too many of these raids. Yes, we've had a lot of parts where you kind of have to run by shit, but for the most part, we haven't had a boss fight where stealth is included in the mechanics. The Gorgons were just part of a maze. It wasn't an actual counter. You didn't really get a drop from it, so essentially I didn't want to include that as part of a boss fight. But stealth was included in that particular encounter, which is why I can't give dogs a much higher score, because essentially we haven't seen this in a raid fight, but we have seen it in the raid before. The damage unlock. How difficult is it to unlock the damage? It's essentially a 2, and here's the reality. You can do it right away. If you want, you can just go right up to a dog and start the damage phase, but the reality is you have to build your buff up by running around the room, getting powered at each one of the flowers, and after you've powered yourself up enough, then you could go kill the dogs. But essentially the damage unlock phase does not require you to have a lot and can actually start prematurely if you go see the dogs a little bit too early. Variety of strategy. What can you use to kill the dogs? And here I really gave it a 1. The reality is you have to do something that does up close damage. Shotguns, whether it's the Acreus, the Ikelos, now the threat level, certain supers at the time, whether it was a grenade that did a lot of damage, Nova Bomb could do damage, Golden Gun certainly works, but essentially you need up close singular damage in order to kill the dog. So I really don't see too much of variety in strategy, so this is why this one has a 1. Direct boss threat level. This is an absolute 0. The dogs themselves pose no threat to you when you're doing this dog phase. At no point do they hurt you. At no point do they attack you. The only elements that attack you during this particular fight are the ads in the room. Whether it's the Cabal that come down, the dogs that are going to be munching on your ass when you're trying to kill the main dogs, but they pose no direct threat level to you in order for you to beat them. Mobility of the fight. For the most part, when it comes to the fight itself, there's really not too much mobility. Yes, you are moving around the room in order to get powered at each flower, but the reality is, you can kind of beat the dogs with just 2 flowers. If you go to the L1 R2 flower or R1 L2 flower, you're not really traveling very far. You could basically hit those as quickly as possible, run to the next flower, and then sure enough, you're powered enough to be able to beat the dogs. Once you're at the dogs, essentially, you're just going to stay there until you kill the motherfucker, and when you play on the prestige mode, you're obviously going to co-kill the 7th and 8th dogs respectively, but for the most part, there's not really a lot of mobility when it comes to the fight with this particular encounter. Recovery. And this is the section that I want to focus on when it comes to this particular raid. Can you recover from a mistake when it comes to this particular raid fight? Now, overall, I gave this a 4. And this is going to be the highest ranking that you're going to see for dogs on all of the categories. A big thing that I consider a part of a raid is the hero moments. Can you recover from something going wrong? If a team were to mess up a crystal, if a team were to drop a chalice, if you drop the sword, if Crota kills you, all these type of raid fights have always had some form of recovery. As raids have progressed with Bungie trying to make raids harder and harder, there were a number of instances where one little mistake is pretty much going to cause a wipe to your team. And to me, that is a frustrating part of the raid, especially when you're trying to teach someone a new part of the raid. Whether you're Sherpering 1, 2, 4, 5 people, all it takes is one mistake, and all of a sudden, 5 people are looking at that one person like, how did you fuck that up? You know, you get some real toxic teams that all of a sudden want to take it out on that one person, but essentially, one error should not cost you an entire raid encounter. It shouldn't cause you to wipe, shouldn't cause you to start the encounter over. I want to be able to recover from a mistake, basically take that mistake, learn from it, and still be able to complete the encounter. With dogs, you can recover from a mistake. Matter of fact, the game actually gives you, I believe it's 3 or 4 chances to kill the dogs entirely, because even if you don't kill them on your first rotation, everybody can return to the room, regroup, go get powered up again, go back out, and still kill the dog. So let's say the dog spots you on the very first rotation. Okay, go do a little bit of damage to your dog, but return to the room. We'll fix that shit right up. If somebody dies, no problem. We'll revive you on the way back. We'll go cover your dog after we need to. But there is room for recovery. And to me, recovery in a raid, hero moments where one person has to pick up the slack for another, one person has to go revive someone or make sure that we don't wipe the encounter. I don't think they need to make it so easy where you can't fail the raid, but I do think there needs to be some level of mistakes that can be corrected within the fight itself so that you can continue the encounter. Teammates needed to unlock the damage phase. Now this one I really went back and forth on because realistically you only need 2 as a bare minimum. All you need is one person holding a crystal, the other person on the floor going to the flowers, run back and forth as many times as possible, and then you're able to get as big a buff as you can. The reality is, you do need a little bit more than this. Yes, 6 people certainly will do more damage. 2 people holding the crystals, 4 people doing the flowers, you're going to be as powered as possible. But realistically, bare minimum you would need, where it's normal damage, I would say is 3 people. Whether you put 2 on the crystals and just have one person running back and forth on the floor, or whether you do 1 person on the crystal with 2 guys on the floor, realistically, this could be done with 3 people. More people, obviously they add the more damage. Less people makes it a little difficult with only 2, but essentially I do think 3 is the bare minimum that you would need for teammates. Difficulty at launch. Now, how difficult was the dog encounter when the raid launched all those years ago when the Leviathan came out? I'm giving this a 3. Now, the reason why I give this a 3 is because we didn't have a lot of the tools that we have nowadays. I'm sure guns like the Whisper would have made encounters much easier back in the year 1 of Leviathan. I'm sure guns like the Outbreak Prime are certainly going to make any encounter easier. We didn't have a well back then. We didn't have Blade Barrage, essentially still use Golden Gun or whatever the case is. No Nova Warp. So what we were stuck with at the time were underpowered characters that hadn't received major buffs and pretty shitty guns. The difficulty at launch I give this is a 3. Not because the encounter was difficult, but because back then Destiny just wasn't as powered as we thought it would be. Final piece is the rewards, and I had to give this a 1. Now, prior to a patch that launched, the only things that you could get from this encounter, aside from armor, was, I believe, the rocket launcher and the scout rifle. Eventually they changed it where you were able to get the Midnight Coup, but it wasn't until after that patch. For the most part, there is nothing in the reward system that makes you want to get this particular encounter. The armor sets were the same. Whether you did normal or prestige, there was no different in the armor. The guns themselves, there wasn't anything special that you absolutely had to have. Every other encounter could get Sins of the Past after the patch. After the patch, they took Midnight Coup, which only dropped from Callus, and they added it to all the encounters in the particular raid. But overall, there really wasn't anything where you wanted from the dog encounter where you would just go get that checkpoint and farm that shit non-stop. So, throwing the scores up on the screen, you can see all the listing of the points that I had. Overall, the dog scored all the way at the bottom with the number 21. That's why it's number 10 on the list. In the next video, we're going to get another shitty boss. And you'll get to see the new scoring rating for that one. So, stay tuned. We got 9 more videos to rank all the raid bosses. As always, rate, comment, subscribe, and all that good shit. And I'll see you guys in the next video.